There was a world, not the world as it would come to be known, not the land of monsters and magic of destiny carved in blood and steel. A world that existed in a state that might be called innocence, though such words feel inadequate when applied to something so vast and indifferent. A world where the rules were carved into being by the slow grinding of ages, where water flowed downhill because that was the only direction it knew, where fire burned and consumed and nothing more, where death was final as that age understood it. The Aen Seidhe knew this world. They had walked beneath its moons for longer than their own memories could easily trace. Though they were not the first, the gnomes had been there longest, or so the oldest songs claimed. Though the true age of their arrival has long been lost. The dwarves had come next, establishing themselves in mountain halls before the elves sailed to the continent's shores in white ships, through means that later generations would struggle to understand. The elves built their cities in harmony with ancient forests, their songs echoing through valleys that had never heard the howl of anything that would later be called unnatural. They called themselves the Elder Folk, and in this they were accurate relative to what would come after, though the gnomes and dwarves had deeper claim to antiquity. In those days, the elves shaped wood and stone with craft learned over long periods. They sang to the trees, and the trees grew as trees grow, responding to cultivation and care developed through generations of observation. Whether these abilities were the same as what later ages would call magic is uncertain. When an elf died, the body was returned to earth. Death was a door that closed, its passage final within the world as it was then structured. The world before the conjunction was not paradise. The Aen Seidhe warred among themselves over territory and pride. Disease still claimed lives, famine could grip a region when harvest failed. But these were natural cruelties, comprehensible in their mechanics. A blight was a blight, caused by weather or soil or the mysterious decline that sometimes struck crops. It was not the work of a curse, not the manifestation of some parallel reality's hunger. Those who would later attempt to chronicle what came after struggled to convey the fundamental difference. How could one explain the absence of something to those who had never known its lack? The world simply was, and within its boundaries, everything that existed followed rules that could be learned, predicted, understood through observation and experience. Across the Great Water, on lands the Aen Seidhe had limited contact with, other peoples followed their own paths. The dwarves, established in their mountain halls before the elves' arrival, carved their kingdoms from living rock through engineering and accumulated knowledge. Their forges burned with carefully tended fires, fed by coal and wood, producing steel through metallurgy that was art refined across generations. The gnomes, eldest of all the continent's peoples, built their mechanisms and pursued their crafts with characteristic ingenuity. The halflings, already long established in their agricultural wisdom by the time elves arrived, coaxed abundance from soil through methods refined over time spans that even elven memory could not fully encompass. This was the crucial element, the defining characteristic of existence before the conjunction. Everything had limits. The world was bounded, comprehensible, mysterious. Yes, vast beyond any single life's ability to explore it fully, but not fundamentally unknowable. Given time and attention, any phenomenon could be understood. Every effect had a cause that, if traced back far enough, terminated in something that could be touched, measured, known. The dragons were there. They had always been there, or so it seemed to the younger races who found them already ancient when their own civilizations were young, great worms who hoarded gold and knowledge with equal jealousy, who spoke in riddles and occasionally descended from mountain caves to burn villages or demand tribute. Whether what the dragons possessed was magic in the sense that word would later carry, or simply abilities beyond other creatures' understanding, remained a matter that would only find context after the conjunction provided comparison. The world turned on its axis. Seasons changed. The moons waxed and waned. Children were born, grew, aged, died. This was the rhythm of existence, predictable in its broad strokes even when individual lives were cut short by violence or misfortune. It was a world that could be cruel, even terrible, but it was honest in its cruelty. What came could be seen coming. What caused drought could be understood, even if it could not be stopped. The night sky told no lies then. The stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, constellations the elves had mapped over millennia. Navigators could chart courses by celestial movements that never varied, never stuttered, never showed the slightest crack in their clockwork precision. The universe was a mechanism of unimaginable scale, but a mechanism nonetheless, following rules that might be beyond full comprehension, but were at least consistent. Some among the Aen Seidhe and the other elder races possessed what might be termed exceptional abilities, whether these constituted what would later be called magic, or represented the furthest edges of natural capacity. The distinction mattered less before the conjunction provided a reference point for comparison. Healers whose understanding of herbs and anatomy seemed to transcend normal learning. Hunters who moved through wilderness with awareness that appeared preternatural. Craftsmen whose works achieved quality suggesting insight beyond technique alone. Whether these were talents refined through practice or something more fundamental became a question only in retrospect. The world had its mysteries. Deep in the oldest forests, in places where even the Aen Seidhe rarely ventured, there were clearings where the trees grew in perfect circles, where the light seemed subtly wrong. Ancient ruins from civilizations even the elves knew nothing about, their purposes lost to time. Strange stones arranged in patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. Stories from that age, filtered through generations and the trauma of what would come, speak of mysteries that may have presaged the future. Whether they truly did, or whether later minds imposed pattern where none existed, cannot be known. In the deep places of the earth, the dwarves sometimes found chambers that should not exist, cut too precisely, angled in ways that hurt the mind to contemplate. They attributed these to the Old Ones, to races that had come before even the dwarves, and they sealed these chambers and marked them as forbidden. Sealed chambers can be understood, even if what they contain cannot. They are still part of the world, still subject to its rules, even if their purpose remains opaque. The dragons knew things. This was acknowledged. In their mountain lairs, surrounded by hoarded gold and stolen knowledge, the great worms possessed understanding that spanned ages. They spoke of cycles and patterns, of the slow turning of vast cosmic wheels. But their knowledge was still knowledge, accumulated over lifetimes that stretched for centuries, not mystical insight granted by forces beyond the world. They were simply very old, very intelligent creatures who remembered things long forgotten by shorter-lived races. And so the world continued, age after age, following its established patterns. Civilizations rose and fell. The Aen Seidhe built their cities of living wood and white stone, raised towers that reached toward the sky, but never higher than sound engineering would allow. The dwarves delved deeper into their mountains, each generation pushing a little further into the earth's bones. The gnomes refined their crafts, each mechanism more clever than the last. The halflings tended their gardens and told their stories and lived their quiet lives in their comfortable holes. War came and went. Droughts arrived and departed. Plagues swept through populations and burned themselves out. Kings ruled justly or cruelly and eventually died, to be replaced by their heirs who ruled in their turn. It was the way of things, comprehensible in its cycles even when the specific events remained unpredictable. No one prayed for miracles because miracles did not occur as they would later be understood. The gods, if they existed, were distant and silent, their influence on the world indistinguishable from natural chance. No divine intervention stayed the executioner's blade or turned aside the plague. When the crops failed, no amount of supplication brought rain. Prayer might bring comfort to the one praying, might create community and shared purpose among believers, but it did not alter material reality in ways that could be verified. This was the world's innocence, not that it was free from suffering, but that suffering had comprehensible sources and potentially preventable causes. Death was final as that age understood it. Whatever lay beyond that final door remained beyond return. The dead stayed dead. The lost stayed lost. Grief was final because loss was final. The night sky held no portents. Comets were lumps of ice and rock following orbital mechanics, not omens of disaster or great change. Eclipses occurred because moons passed between world and sun, following trajectories that could be calculated and predicted with precision. The aurora that sometimes danced across northern skies was a wonder, beautiful and mysterious, but a natural phenomenon waiting for some clever mind to unravel its mechanisms. There were no prophecies because there was no mechanism by which the future could be known. Wise men made predictions based on observation and experience, and sometimes these predictions proved accurate, but this was simply intelligence applied to pattern recognition, not genuine foresight. The future remained unwritten, genuinely open, containing infinite possible paths that would be determined by choices and chances, and the complex interaction of countless factors. The world was, in its way, lonely. Each sphere of existence was isolated, complete unto itself, following its own trajectory through the void. The Aen Seidhe looked up at stars and wondered if other worlds orbited those distant lights, if other races gazed up at their own skies and contemplated the same questions. But these were philosophical speculations, not practical concerns. The distance between stars was absolute, unbreachable. Each world was an island in an infinite dark sea, and that was simply how reality was structured. This isolation was fundamental to the world's stability. Each sphere developed according to its own internal logic, shaped by its own unique history and conditions. The laws that governed one world were supreme and inviolable within that world's boundaries. Cause led to effect with perfect consistency. The future grew organically from the past, branches from a trunk, each new growth determined by what had come before, and the conditions that currently existed. And then there was a moment when the walls between worlds grew thin, when the boundaries that separated one reality from another became permeable, when the isolation that had always existed began to crack. No one noticed at first. No alarm bells rang. No prophets cried out in warning. The change was subtle, a wrongness so slight that it registered only as unease, as the vague sense that something was not quite right, a dream that lingered too clearly upon waking, a bird that flew in a direction birds did not typically fly, a flower blooming in the wrong season, small things, meaningless things. Except they were not meaningless. They were symptoms, warning tremors before the earthquake, the last normal moments before everything that the word normal meant ceased to have meaning.
The world held its breath.
And then the worlds collided. No one alive witnessed the conjunction itself and survived unchanged. That is, perhaps the most fundamental truth about that moment when realities overlapped. Those who were conscious during the collision, who saw with unclouded eyes the instant when the walls between worlds shattered, those minds could not contain what they perceived. Some went mad immediately, their reason unable to process stimuli that should not exist. Others managed to function for hours, days, sometimes weeks before the full weight of what they had witnessed crushed their sanity. The few fragmentary accounts that survive, recorded by survivors whose memories remained intact enough to speak coherently of that night, describe impossibilities. The sky, they said, was wrong. Not dark, not light, but both simultaneously and neither. Colors that had no names bleeding into each other. Hues that the eye could perceive, but the mind could not classify. Some described it as if the dome of heaven had become translucent, revealing something beyond that should never be seen. Whether these were literal observations or minds attempting to process the incomprehensible remains unclear. Fragments of testimony gathered by unnamed chroniclers in the years that followed contain attempts to systematize accounts that shared certain elements, while differing wildly in specific details. All who witnessed the event described wrongness, reality becoming unstable in ways that defied description, even as the experiences remained seared into memory. All who witnessed the conjunction described a sense of wrongness, of reality becoming unstable. One account compared it to standing on solid ground that suddenly revealed itself to be a thin crust over empty space. The fundamental reliability of existence, the basic trust that the world would continue following its established patterns, evaporated in an instant. The initial manifestation seems to have been visual, though seeing is perhaps the wrong term for perceiving something that exists outside the spectrum of normal light. Multiple accounts describe spheres or bubbles in the air, translucent surfaces that reflected and refracted light in impossible ways. These were not metaphorical spheres, but literal manifestations of other worlds pressing against the fabric of reality, trying to occupy the same space that was already occupied. A dwarf whose account circulated through oral tradition described watching his own hand become momentarily transparent during the height of the conjunction, seeing through flesh to bone to something beyond. Another hand occupying the same point in space, but belonging to something else entirely. When he pulled back in terror, the vision faded, but the experience of seeing through reality to what lay beneath remained burned into memory. The conjunction was not a single event, but a cascade, breaches occurring rapidly across the world. Whether there was an initial point of contact, some specific location where realities first touched, cannot be determined from surviving accounts. What remains certain is that within a brief span, the entire world experienced the effect, or nearly so. From frozen northern wastes to southern reaches, from western waters to eastern peaks, every location felt reality ripple and tear. The speed itself suggested the conjunction was affecting not merely locations within the world, but the world's fundamental substrate. In some locations, matter from different spheres attempted to manifest in the same space, resulting in explosions of force that leveled structures and incinerated everything within reach. Whole settlements vanished, replaced by smoking craters or, more disturbingly, by alien landscapes that existed in violation of the world's previous rules. Where the collision was less violent but no less complete, the results proved even more disturbing to those who survived to see them. A forest might find itself interwoven with another forest from elsewhere, trees from two different realities growing through each other in configurations that made observers physically ill to perceive. Accounts speak of sound, though again, sound seems inadequate, a tone that vibrated through everything, felt in the bones and teeth, a frequency that made reality itself resonate. Some described it as music, though music that followed no scale or rhythm recognizable to any culture. Others called it the death scream of the world, the sound of existence itself being torn apart. During the height of the conjunction, time itself became unstable. Multiple accounts describe experiencing the same moment repeatedly, or perceiving events in reverse, or feeling time stretch until seconds became hours. Accounts attributed to survivors describe experiencing temporal distortions, moments that seem to repeat, events perceived in reverse, time stretching or compressing in ways that defied normal experience. When stability returned to some degree, witnesses stood in locations where multiple outcomes seemed to have occurred simultaneously, though which had been real remained unclear. The isolation that had always defined each world's existence shattered like glass. Suddenly, impossibly, other realms were not theoretical possibilities, but immediate, tangible presences. The barriers that kept each sphere of existence separate and inviolable proved not to be barriers at all, but membranes, and those membranes had torn. What came through the tears defied categorization. They were not invaders, not in any meaningful sense, because invasion implies intention and organization. They were spillage, overflow, reality from other worlds bleeding through into a space that was already full. Some of what emerged would later be recognized as creatures, though that term suggests a degree of biological organization that many of these things lacked. Others were more abstract, forces or phenomena or concepts given incomprehensible physical form. In the chaos that followed, whether immediately or in the days and weeks after, creatures began appearing that would later be cataloged and named by those who learned to hunt them. Beings that would come to be called werewolves materialized, killing before anyone understood what they were fighting. The fiends came through, massive and terrible, their third eyes already possessing the hypnotic power that would make them legendary threats. The griffins, part lion and part eagle, but neither, biological impossibilities given flesh, shrieked as they found themselves in an alien sky. The drowners pulled themselves from waters they had never entered, drawn by instincts from worlds where water meant something different. And these were merely the creatures that were, in some sense, comprehensible. For each monster that could be named and categorized, dozens of other things emerged that could not be adequately described, forms that shifted and changed as they moved, as if unable to maintain stable configurations in this new reality. Entities that existed in more dimensions than the eye could perceive, visible only in fragments and angles, presences without bodies, intelligences without form, hungers without mouths. Accounts speak of the sky appearing wrong, colors that had no names pouring across the heavens, auroras of madness that drove those who gazed at them too long into fits or catatonia. The stars, those fixed points that had guided navigators since time immemorial, shifted in their positions or vanished entirely or multiplied impossibly. Constellations that had held their shapes for millennia, warped and reformed, their light arriving from angles that should not exist. The moons behaved strangely. Some accounts describe seeing multiple moons simultaneously, each casting shadows in different directions, though whether this was reality distortion or trauma-induced hallucination cannot be verified. The number varied in different accounts. When normality returned to some degree, whether the same moon remained as had always hung in the night sky could not be determined with certainty. Magic entered the world during this chaos, though the word itself would come later. In worlds where it had always existed, where the force later called chaos followed rules and could be learned, it was governed by principles accumulated over millennia. Here, in this world that had never known it, the force simply existed, raw and undirected. Whether this was the same power the elves had touched in gentler ways, or something entirely new, became a question without clear answer. What was certain was that control required understanding, and understanding required time that the first to experience it did not have. The first generation to experience this force's arrival often died. Their abilities manifested spontaneously, without training or guidance. Stories from this period speak of manifestations of power, without control or understanding. Fire that could not be contained. Transformations that could not be reversed. The pattern repeated. Manifestation, loss of control, death. But some survived. Through instinct or luck, or perhaps some innate capacity that made them slightly more compatible with these forces, certain individuals managed to manifest abilities without immediate self-destruction. These survivors became the foundation upon which understanding would eventually be built, though that building would span generations and consume countless lives in its construction. Reality had become porous. The fundamental certainty that had always defined existence, the basic reliability of physical law, no longer held absolute authority. Stones fell upward in some locations. Water burned. The dead stirred. None of these phenomena followed consistent patterns or could be predicted or controlled. They were symptoms of reality's sickness, local failures of cosmic structures overwhelmed by the infection of incompatible forces. Accounts differ regarding duration. Some survivors experienced what felt like days of chaos. Others insisted the entire event occupied no more than a few minutes. Whether this represents actual temporal distortion or the unreliability of traumatized memory remains unknowable. The variability itself was evidence of how profoundly time had been affected. As what would have been dawn approached, in a world where the sun still followed predictable patterns, the intensity of the overlapping realities began to diminish, not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, like a fever breaking. The visible rifts in the sky started to close, though they never completely sealed. The sense of multiple worlds occupying the same space began to fade, though echoes remained. But the damage was done. The barriers between worlds had been breached. And while the initial catastrophic overlap diminished, it did not reverse. The spillage from other realities had occurred, and what had spilled through could not be put back. The creatures from other worlds were present now, as real and physical as the native flora and fauna. The force that would be called magic had soaked into the fabric of existence and could not be extracted. The world that emerged was fundamentally altered, not merely changed, but rewritten at its core. Its basic nature transformed. The rules that had governed reality for eons had been overwritten by exceptions and contradictions. The dead could rise. Fire could freeze. Forces could reshape matter. These things were now possible because the category of impossible had been catastrophically redefined. In the immediate aftermath, in those first hours when the full extent of the transformation began to become apparent, no one understood what had truly happened. They lacked the conceptual framework, the vocabulary, even the basic metaphors to make sense of it. All they knew was that the world had ended. Not literally, not in the sense of physical destruction, though vast regions had indeed been destroyed. The world had ended in the sense that everything known about how reality functioned had been proven false. The sun rose on a world that looked familiar, but was alien. The same mountains stood on the horizon, but they were not the same mountains. The same forests stretched across the landscape, but they were not the same forests. Everything that remained carried the taint of the conjunction, subtle wrongness that could not be unseen once perceived. And in the ruins and in the wreckage and the shattered remnants of their civilizations, the survivors began to understand that they would have to learn to live in this new reality, this reality that included monsters and forces beyond understanding and death that was not necessarily final as it had once been. The world had not ended. It had transformed into something worse.
It had transformed into something that required new words, new skills, new kinds of courage.
It had transformed into the world that would need those who could fight what had come through. Silence came first, not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful night, but a stillness so profound it pressed against the ears like physical weight. The conjunction had been loud in ways that sound alone could not capture, reality screaming as it tore. And when it finally ceased, the absence of that cacophony was almost as disturbing as its presence had been. Survivors found themselves in landscapes that looked almost normal, almost familiar, and that almost was the source of new terror. A settlement whose name has been lost to time, which had stood for generations in a river valley, emerged from the conjunction to find itself straddling two different rivers. The original river still flowed as it always had, but now a second watercourse occupied the same physical space, its water somehow distinct from the first, different in color and temperature and the way light refracted through them. The settlement's buildings stood half in one reality, half in another. Citizens who tried to enter their homes found doorways that opened onto rooms that were theirs, but also not theirs. Furnished with objects they recognized alongside objects they had never seen. The survivors attempted to restore normalcy. They organized work parties to repair damaged buildings, to tend to the wounded, to count the dead. But the normal tools of recovery failed when applied to supernatural disaster. A healer skilled in treating wounds found herself helpless when confronted with a patient whose flesh had been partially replaced by something crystalline, neither living nor dead, but existing in some intermediate state that had no name. Traditional understanding assumed certain constants about anatomy and the nature of flesh, and those constants no longer held. The dead presented problems that the living were unprepared to solve. Elven culture had always treated death with reverence. The body returned to earth in carefully maintained groves, where the deceased could, in a metaphorical sense, continue as part of the living forest. But now some of the dead did not stay dead. Not all of them, not even most, but enough a corpse that had been properly prepared for burial opened its eyes and sat up, though the thing that animated it bore little resemblance to the person who had died. It wore their face, spoke with their voice, but the words made no sense, strung together in combinations that followed no linguistic rules. The survivors learned, through painful trial, that the old methods of dealing with death no longer sufficed. Fire became necessary. Immediate cremation before whatever force was causing reanimation could take hold. This violated deeply held beliefs about proper treatment of the deceased, added spiritual trauma to the existing physical and mental anguish. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was watching loved ones rise as hollow mockeries, dangerous and pitiable in equal measure. In the dwarf holds, different problems emerged. The dwarves had always lived underground, their cities carved from living rock, their forges burning in the mountain's heart. They had survived the conjunction better than most surface dwellers, insulated by countless tons of stone from the worst of the reality tiers. But the earth itself had been affected. Tunnels that had been stable for centuries suddenly collapsed without warning. New passages appeared where solid rock should be, leading deeper into impossible geography that connected to places that should not exist. A dwarf mining expedition encountered what would later be recognized as a portal, though the concept did not yet exist to describe it. They broke through into what they expected to be a new vein of ore, and instead found a chamber that extended further than their torchlight could reach, filled with structures that were clearly made rather than natural, but followed no architectural principles they recognized. When they attempted to explore, 2 dwarves vanished, simply failed to return. Search parties found no trace, no bodies, no signs of struggle. The chamber was sealed, the passage collapsed. The entire section of the mine declared forbidden. The gnomes faced catastrophic losses. Their cities, built above ground with their characteristic combination of artistry and engineering, had suffered direct exposure to the conjunction's worst effects. Entire districts had been replaced by alien landscapes, buildings from other worlds superimposed over or merged with their own. Some gnomish settlements were found later by explorers to be inhabited by creatures that seemed almost but not quite familiar, entities that moved with wrong rhythms, that spoke in sounds approximating language without actually forming words. The surviving gnomes, brilliant and practical, attempted to approach the catastrophe with their characteristic analytical mindset. They documented, measured, theorized. They created the first systematic observations of post-conjunction phenomena, recording which natural laws still held and which had been superseded. This research, conducted in those first terrible weeks, would eventually prove invaluable to later generations trying to understand what had occurred. But in the immediate aftermath, knowledge provided no comfort. Understanding that reality had been fundamentally rewritten did not make living in the rewritten reality any easier. Communication between settlements became nightmarishly difficult. The roads that had connected communities were no longer reliable. A path that had been safe for centuries might now lead through regions where reality remained unstable, where travelers could become lost, not in physical space, but in the gaps between spaces. Merchants who had traveled the same routes for years found familiar landmarks replaced or altered beyond recognition. An elven courier, whose account survives in fragments, kept records of attempts to reach the coastal cities in the weeks following the conjunction. The account describes a journey that should have taken 4 days, but required 3 weeks, detoured repeatedly by transformed landscapes. A bridge that crossed a gorge, previously traversed countless times, now led nowhere, its far end opening onto a landscape of black glass and copper trees existing under a green sky. The forest that had always provided passage had become a maze where direction lost meaning, where heading north might bring a traveler back to their starting point from the south. The first encounters with beings that would eventually be catalogued as Leshen occurred in elven forests. Creatures of wood and antler appeared, standing 4 times the height of an elf, existing in forms that seemed woven from forest material itself. Whether these beings attempted communication remains uncertain from the accounts. The elves, terrified and desperate, attacked with bows and spears. In encounters that followed, elves died before the creatures fell through decapitation and burning. The survivors could not determine what the beings had been or wanted, whether they were defending territory or seeking understanding. The ambiguity would persist in later encounters with similar entities, but such philosophical considerations were luxuries for later times. In the immediate aftermath, survival trumped ethics. The creatures that came through the conjunction were alien, dangerous, unpredictable. Understanding their nature was secondary to avoiding being killed by them. The survivors, whether elven, dwarven, gnomish, or halfling, learned the same brutal lesson. The world had become a place where safety could no longer be assumed, where walking familiar paths required weapons and vigilance. The environmental effects created cascading problems. Crops failed in fields where reality had become unstable, plants growing into impossible configurations, or simply dying for no apparent reason. Water sources became contaminated, not with physical pollutants, but with something subtler, something that made those who drank from them sick in ways that no healer could treat. Livestock died, or worse, transformed. Domestic animals becoming aggressive or developing features that no natural animal should possess. Famine followed the initial devastation. The careful agricultural systems that had sustained civilizations were disrupted beyond easy repair. Seeds planted in ground that had been exposed to the conjunction produced crops that were inedible or poisonous or grew into forms that bore no resemblance to what had been planted. Stored food rotted at accelerated rates in some locations, or remained perfectly preserved in others, despite conditions that should have spoiled it immediately. The old knowledge about farming and food preservation became unreliable, each rule now subject to exceptions that could not be predicted. Disease arrived in the wake of destruction. The symptoms were sometimes conventional, fever, weakness, delirium, but sometimes the afflicted developed lesions that wept liquid light, or their eyes turned colors that had no names, or they spoke in languages no one recognized, voices overlapping their own. The sick died, or did not die, but continued in states that resembled life without actually being it. The healers had no framework. Their herbs and poultices worked or did not work with no discernible pattern. A remedy that saved one patient killed the next fever, responded to cooling compresses until suddenly it required heat instead. Bodies healed at supernatural speeds or refused to heal at all, wounds remaining open and fresh for weeks. The accumulated medical knowledge of centuries became insufficient overnight. In the months that followed the conjunction, children born showed signs of lingering effects. Not all of them. Many were healthy, normal, gave their parents brief moments of hope that perhaps life could return to what it had been. But others came into the world already marked by the event that had reshaped reality. Some bore physical deformities that were merely tragic, the sort of birth defects that had always occasionally occurred, but others possessed features that could not be attributed to natural variation. Extra eyes that saw things the parents could not perceive, skin that shifted color with emotion, voices that resonated at frequencies that made listeners nauseous. The response to these children varied. Some communities embraced them, saw them as survivors of a cataclysm, innocents who deserved protection regardless of their differences. Other communities reacted with fear, saw the children as embodiments of the wrongness that had infected the world, threats that needed to be eliminated before they could spread whatever corruption they carried. Infanticide occurred. Abandonment in forests became common enough that it ceased to shock. The fortunate ones were simply driven out, exiled from communities that could not bear to look at them. And councils convened across what remained of organized elven society, recorded in accounts whose legibility suggests the trauma of those recording them. Leaders gathered to discuss survival strategies. The assembled represented what remained. Nobles whose territories had been devastated, military commanders whose forces had been decimated, scholars whose libraries had burned or transformed into incomprehensible masses of pages that no longer contained readable text. They gathered in halls that had survived structurally intact, but were forever changed in subtle ways. The acoustics were wrong. Voices echoed when they should not. Shadows fell at incorrect angles. The deliberations, preserved in fragmentary form, revealed the depth of despair that gripped the survivors. Proposals ranged from pragmatic to desperate to mad. Some argued for abandoning the affected regions entirely, migrating to lands that had perhaps been spared the worst effects. Others insisted on attempting to restore what had been lost, though none could articulate how such restoration might be achieved when the fundamental rules governing reality had been rewritten. A few suggested simply waiting, hoping that whatever had caused the conjunction might reverse itself, that reality might heal given time. One proposal, preserved without attribution of its source, argued for systematic extermination of anything that had come through the rifts. Every creature, every plant, every object from the other worlds should be hunted down and destroyed before it could spread further corruption. The other council members rejected the proposal not on ethical grounds, but practical ones. How could they identify what belonged and what did not when the boundaries had become so blurred? How could they wage war against an invasion that had no front lines, no command structure, no unified enemy to fight? The councils dissolved without reaching meaningful conclusions. Each leader returned to their own devastated territories to implement whatever survival strategies seemed most viable in their specific circumstances. Unity, already fractured by the conjunction, broke down further as each community turned inward, focused on immediate survival rather than collective recovery. Later chronicles would speak of dragons attempting to restore order through force, descending upon regions where reality remained particularly unstable. They burned creatures that seemed alien, incinerated growths that violated natural law as they understood it. The task proved impossible. For each abomination destroyed, others manifested. The corruption had spread too widely, embedded itself too deeply in reality's fabric. Other dragons simply fled. They took wing and flew until they found regions that seemed less affected. Mountain peaks where the air still tasted right. Isolated valleys where reality remained relatively stable. They hoarded their knowledge alongside their gold, retreating into isolation rather than confront a world that no longer made sense, even to their ancient understanding. The halflings, practical as always, focused on the immediate necessities of survival. Their communities had always been agrarian, built around the patient work of cultivation and harvest. The conjunction threatened to destroy that way of life entirely. Fields that had produced reliable crops for generations now grew things that defied categorization. A potato patch might yield vegetables that looked normal, but caused vivid hallucinations when consumed. Wheat grew stalks that reached impossible heights, the grain at their tops exposed to wind and weather that existed several feet above where weather should be. The halflings adapted through trial and error, a process that cost lives but eventually yielded practical knowledge. Certain fields proved more reliable than others, though the pattern made no sense. A plot of land touched directly by conjunction energies might produce normal crops, while an adjacent field that seemed unaffected grew nothing but toxic weeds. Seeds brought from distant regions sometimes thrived, sometimes died immediately, sometimes produced plants that resembled the original species in name only. Halfling farmers documented their experiments during the first planting season after the conjunction. Records describe planting the same crop in 20 different locations, varying soil preparation, irrigation, proximity to structures or trees. 15 plots failed completely. 3 produced something edible. 2 yielded crops that were superior to anything grown before the conjunction, vegetables of extraordinary size and nutrition. The pattern could not be determined from the results. The force that would be called magic had entered the world, but understanding it was a process measured in generations, not days. The first to survive manifesting abilities related to this force did so through accident and instinct rather than training or knowledge. Some found themselves able to sense emotions from those around them, an ability that began as vague impressions and intensified until distinguishing personal feelings from the emotional states of everyone nearby became impossible. Control was learned through isolation and meditation, spending months alone in wilderness until mental techniques to shield against the constant bombardment were developed. Others were less fortunate. Those who discovered they could move objects with thought found the ability activated in response to emotion rather than conscious will. When startled or frightened or angry, everything nearby became a potential projectile. Some killed without meaning to before their own communities made terrible decisions to restrain them permanently, binding them in rooms where there was nothing that could accidentally become a weapon. They lived months or years like that before finding ways to end their own lives. The patterns that would eventually become formalized as magical disciplines existed only as random occurrences, tragic or beneficial by pure chance, fire that leaped from fingertips, ice that formed from nothing, the ability to heal wounds through touch, though whether this was the same force or some other post-conjunction phenomenon remained unclear. No teachers existed, no accumulated knowledge to guide those who found themselves suddenly capable of violating physical law. Some among the elder races began to recognize that certain actions, certain gestures or words or mental states produced repeatable effects. Based on what later generations learned, certain patterns can be inferred. Tracing a specific pattern in the air while focusing on heat might reliably produce flame. Humming a particular sequence of tones while concentrating on stone could make rock more malleable. These were the first attempts at what would be called spells, though the casters did not think of them in those terms. They were simply techniques, ways of interacting with forces that now existed in the world. But the cost of this knowledge was measured in lives. For every successful application, 10 attempts resulted in catastrophic failure. The forces being manipulated were not well understood. The margins for error were non-existent. An attempt to create light might instead create heat intense enough to immolate everything nearby. An attempt to move an object through force of will might cause it to explode, or vanish, or transform into something toxic. Those who lived long enough to learn from their mistakes gradually accumulated understanding through survival. Time passed. Days became weeks, became months. The initial shock began to fade, replaced by grim determination or numb acceptance. The world would not return to what it had been. That much was clear. The conjunction had not been a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent alteration. Survival required adaptation, learning to exist in a world that followed new rules, or more accurately, followed the old rules inconsistently, subject to exceptions that could not be predicted. The count of the dead would never be complete. Entire settlements had vanished, their populations killed or transformed, or simply gone, absorbed into rifts that had since closed. The survivors could only estimate losses, and those estimates ranged from catastrophic to apocalyptic. Perhaps 1 in 5 had died directly, perhaps more, and this count did not include those who survived physically but were destroyed mentally, who lived on as shells, their minds broken by what they had witnessed. There was no recovery, only continuation.
The world had not ended, but it had irrevocably transformed, and those who remained in it would spend the rest of their lives learning how to survive in its ruins.
The creatures came in waves, or perhaps they were always arriving, and awareness of them simply accumulated as survivors learned to recognize what they were seeing. Kikimora emerged from swamps that had been safe for centuries, here transformed by passage through realities, or perhaps native to whichever sphere they originated from. They manifested as chitinous horrors, massive and predatory. They nested in abandoned settlements, their presence transforming structures of wood and stone into webbed hives. The griffins found mountains to their liking, established territories on peaks that had been accessible. They hunted deer and elk when available, but showed no hesitation in taking elven or dwarf prey when opportunity presented. Their intelligence was evident in how they hunted, using tactics that suggested understanding of their quarry's behavior, setting ambushes that required forethought and planning. Whether this was genuine sapience or sophisticated instinct remained debated by those few who studied them and survived the study. Neckers bred in the dark places, underground warrens and cave systems where they multiplied at rates that seemed impossible. A single nest discovered and destroyed would be replaced by 3 more within weeks. Their rapid reproduction and aggressive territoriality made them more dangerous through persistence than through individual threat. A lone necker was manageable. A swarm was devastating. Entire mining operations were abandoned when necker infestations proved impossible to eradicate. The ghouls gathered wherever death occurred, drawn to corpses by senses that operated beyond smell or sight. They consumed the dead with a hunger that seemed to exceed mere nutritional need, as if the act of devouring flesh served some other purpose, ritual or sustenance on a level beyond the physical. Communities learned to burn their dead immediately, not just to prevent reanimation, but to avoid attracting ghoul packs that would dig up graves and desecrate even the ashes if given opportunity. Drowners appeared in waters that had never harbored anything more dangerous than fish. They looked almost human, or perhaps had been human once in whatever world they originated from, but were now something else entirely. They dragged swimmers and fishermen beneath the surface, drowning them in water too shallow for drowning to be possible, pulling them through liquid into spaces that water should not contain. Bodies recovered from drowner attacks bore marks that suggested the victims had experienced far longer submersion than the brief seconds they had been pulled under. The werewolves were different. They had been human, or elven, or dwarf. The curse that transformed them, if curse was the right word, was another consequence of the conjunction's corruption. Some were bitten by creatures from other worlds and found the bite transmitted something viral, or magical, or metaphysical. Others simply transformed spontaneously, the potential for lycanthropy dormant in their blood, until some combination of moon phase and cosmic alignment triggered it. The transformation was agonizing, bones reshaping, consciousness submerging beneath bestial instinct that retained just enough awareness to choose victims. The afflicted lived in constant terror of the cycle. Some sought isolation, chaining themselves during full moons, begging others to restrain or guard them. Some embraced what they had become, joining or forming packs that hunted with terrible coordination. Some simply ended their own lives rather than risk harming those they loved. The communities developed responses ranging from compassionate to brutal. Some protected their afflicted members, others killed them on sight, seeing the curse as something that would inevitably spread if not contained through extermination. Vampires appeared, though whether they came through the conjunction or had existed in hiding before remains debated in fragments that survive from that era. The evidence suggests they arrived with a collision of spheres, refugees, or immigrants, like so many other creatures. They were not uniform in nature. Some manifested as obviously monstrous forms that fed on blood with mindless hunger. Others retained intelligence and culture from whatever world they originated in. sophisticated beings who established themselves in communities and fed with discretion. The intelligent vampires possessed abilities that made them nearly impossible to kill through conventional means, regenerating from wounds that should prove fatal, moving with speeds beyond natural capacity. The Leshen claimed forests as their domains. Whether they had come through the conjunction or had always existed in some form remains unclear, their origins lost to the chaos of that time. They were beings that seemed woven from wood and root and shadow itself, standing taller than trees, crowned with antlers that captured darkness. Whether they possessed consciousness in any recognizable sense remained unknown. They did not communicate in ways that could be interpreted, or if they attempted communication, it occurred in languages or mediums beyond understanding. They killed intruders into their forests, commanded roots that moved, and animals that attacked with unnatural coordination. Yet they also maintained the forests in their way, suggesting purpose, if not sapience. The world had become a bestiary of horrors, each species presenting unique challenges, requiring different tactics for survival. The old skills of hunters and warriors remained relevant but insufficient. Fighting techniques developed for warfare between intelligent enemies proved inadequate against creatures that ignored pain, regenerated from wounds, attacked with abilities that violated physical law. Knowledge became survival currency. Understanding which creatures were vulnerable to which substances, which tactics worked against which monsters. This knowledge meant the difference between life and death, but gathering such knowledge required proximity to the creatures, required combat and observation and experimentation, and each failed experiment cost lives. The survivors who specialized in fighting monsters, who studied the creatures and developed techniques for killing them, these individuals became valuable beyond measure. They were not numerous, these early monster slayers. Many died in the learning, but those who survived accumulated expertise that communities desperately needed.
They were not yet witchers. That would come later, in generations following, as human mages mastered forces the conjunction had unleashed.
But they were the predecessors, the proof that adaptation was possible, that the species inhabiting this transformed world could learn to fight back against invasion that had already occurred, that could not be prevented but might be contained. The age of monsters had begun, and it would last for centuries, each generation inheriting a world where horror was not exceptional, but ordinary, where survival required accepting that the darkness held things that could not be understood, only fought. Magic did not arrive as gift or discovery. It spilled. The substance of other realities leaked through the cracks the conjunction had torn, and that substance included forces those realities had learned to manipulate, direct, control. But control required understanding, framework, accumulated knowledge, centuries of development. Here, in this world that had never known it in this form, the force simply existed, raw and undirected, available to anyone who could perceive it, but comprehensible to no one. The first generation of those who manifested abilities related to this force died badly. Their powers emerged spontaneously, without training or guidance, and the energies they touched were not forgiving of ignorance. Stories from this period speak of manifestations without control. A child reaching toward warmth, fire erupting beyond containment, a woman wishing for rain, floods drowning valleys, a man seeking to mend a broken tool, transformation into something that sang in frequencies shattering glass and bone. The pattern repeated across the continent: manifestation, loss of control, death. But some survived, through instinct or luck, or perhaps some innate capacity that made them slightly more compatible with these forces. Certain individuals managed to use abilities without immediate self-destruction. These survivors became the foundation upon which understanding would eventually be built, though that building would span generations and consume countless lives in its construction. Fragmentary accounts speak of early practitioners who survived through cautious experimentation. One such account, attributed to an elven woman whose name has not survived clearly in the records, describes one who manifested ability to perceive energy flows, seeing currents in the air that others could not detect, patterns of force that moved through space like invisible rivers. She did not understand what she perceived, possessed no framework for interpretation, but she could see it, and seeing was the first step toward manipulation. The account describes months spent in observation, watching the energy flows, noting their patterns and variations. The flows intensified during certain moon phases. They moved differently around living things than around stone or metal. They responded to emotion and intention in ways that suggested some form of reactive intelligence. When attempts at direct interaction finally occurred, according to the account, they began with the smallest possible effect: a candle flame already burning, an attempt to make it slightly larger. The flame responded, flickering and growing, and for a moment there was connection between intention and effect, the pathway through which will could be translated into physical change. Then the flame exploded, filling the room with fire that consumed everything. Survival came through preparation. The experiment conducted in a stone chamber with a single exit and water standing ready. Burns that would scar permanently, but survival and learning.
The forces responded to intention, but the response was not proportional. Small attempts could produce massive effects. The forces were not stable, not predictable, not safe.
The work continued with even greater caution, techniques developing that others would later refine into formal methods. Visualization of barriers between self and the energy being manipulated, mental constructs that provided some insulation from direct contact with forces that could destroy, working with the smallest possible manipulations, accepting that grand effects were beyond capacity, and probably always would be.
Learning to stop immediately when the energy began to resist, when the forces began to slip from control.
Other early practitioners developed different approaches. A dwarf, whose work was documented in surviving examples, found he could influence metal, not merely shaping it through mundane smithing, but altering its essential properties, making iron harder than steel should be, creating alloys that could not exist according to conventional metallurgy. His work produced weapons and tools of extraordinary quality, but the process aged him rapidly, each act of this manipulation consuming something vital. He died at 40, looking 80. His body withered while his mind remained sharp. The humans who came through the conjunction brought their own traditions, though these were not immediately recognized as such. They spoke of forces they had learned to manipulate in their world, claimed their reality had possessed such abilities for millennia, but the energies available here operated differently, followed different constraints, and what they had known elsewhere required adaptation to function in this environment. The human practitioners had to relearn their art, adapting techniques developed elsewhere to work with forces that behaved in unfamiliar ways. The collision between human knowledge and local discovery produced what would eventually become codified systems. The humans possessed theoretical frameworks, understood these forces as something that could be studied and categorized. The local users possessed practical experience with this world's specific environment. When these streams of knowledge merged, cautiously and over decades, the result was the beginning of genuine systematic understanding. In later generations, mages such as Alzor would push manipulation of living flesh further, experimenting with mutations that would eventually inform the creation of witchers. His work, controversial even among mages, produced creatures that added new horrors to an already dangerous world. Beings he designed to hunt certain monsters instead attacked settlements he had promised to protect, killing dozens before being destroyed. Others escaped into wilderness and bred, spawning lines of creatures that persisted for generations. The records of his eventual fate are unclear, but accounts from later periods suggest his fellow mages turned on him, destroyed him before his experiments could do further damage. The early practitioners discovered that certain materials conducted or contained these energies more effectively than others. Meteoric iron proved particularly resonant, weapons forged from it capable of disrupting effects and harming creatures that were resistant to conventional steel-silver, abundant and previously valued only for its rarity and beauty, was found to be toxic to many post-conjunction creatures, though the mechanism remained mysterious. A blade of silver could kill a werewolf where iron would merely wound. Certain woods, certain stones, certain plants harvested under specific conditions, all these proved useful in working with these forces. The practitioners accumulated this knowledge slowly, each discovery tested and retested, each failure recorded so others might avoid repeating mistakes. A flower blooming only during eclipses produced oils that could be used in preparations, enhancing perception. A mushroom growing in corrupted soil was deadly poison to humans, but harmless to certain monsters, suggesting possibilities for targeted weapons. The roots of trees exposed to conjunction energies could be ground into powders that temporarily enhanced physical strength. Alchemy emerged as a discipline distinct from but related to direct energy manipulation, where some reshaped reality through force of will. Alchemists used mundane processes to produce effects that were extraordinary in result, if not in method. An alchemist could create substances that burned without oxygen, liquids that froze on contact with air, compounds that altered consciousness or perception in specific ways. The distinction between alchemy and chemistry was blurry, perhaps non-existent, but the results were undeniable. The preparations developed by early alchemists were crude and dangerous. A mixture meant to enhance strength might work, but also induce heart failure. A salve intended to accelerate healing might cause flesh to grow without organization, tumors erupting from wounds. A liquid that supposedly granted night vision did provide enhanced visual acuity, but permanent damage to the eyes followed, blindness arriving within days or weeks. The refinement process was lengthy. Testing conducted on volunteers who knew the risks and accepted them because the potential benefits to their communities justified personal sacrifice. Blood proved significant. Practitioners discovered that their own blood, drawn and prepared correctly, could be used in rituals and preparations that were more potent than those created from other materials. This discovery led to practices that outsiders found disturbing. Those who worked with these forces cutting themselves to gather components for their work. Some took it further, using the blood of others, willing donors initially, but eventually moving to less ethical sources. The line between healer and predator became dangerously thin for those who became too focused on their craft's requirements. Signs emerged as a category of force manipulation that was relatively safe, or at least less immediately lethal than other forms. These were simple applications, gestures accompanied by mental focus that produced minor effects. A burst of kinetic force that could knock opponents back. A shield of solidified air that could deflect blows. A flame small enough to light a candle or distract an enemy. The signs did not require the complex preparations of ritual work, could be used rapidly in combat or crisis, though their effects were limited compared to more elaborate workings. The human practitioners brought knowledge of more sophisticated techniques. They spoke of opening oneself to the flow of these energies, of becoming a conduit through which vast power could move. But this approach proved extraordinarily dangerous in the post-conjunction world. The forces here were not the tamed energies they had known in their original world. Opening oneself fully to these energies often resulted in possession, corruption, death, or worse. The human techniques had to be extensively modified, adding layers of protection and limitation that reduced power, but increased survival rates. Portals became possible. Not the rifts that had torn open during the conjunction, but controlled openings between distant points, pathways through space that bypassed the distance between locations. The working required was immense, the risks substantial. Early portal attempts often failed catastrophically, the caster torn apart as space folded incorrectly, or the portal opening onto places that were not places, emptiness between realities where nothing could survive. But successful portals offered travel that would otherwise take weeks or months, compressed into seconds. The strategic and tactical implications were obvious. Teleportation developed as a related but distinct skill. Where portals created fixed pathways that others could potentially use, teleportation moved the caster alone, instantaneously, from one location to another they knew well. The working was even more dangerous than portal creation, the margin for error non-existent. Materializing inside solid matter meant instant death. Arriving even slightly off target could result in falls or drowning or manifestation in hostile environments. But for those who mastered it, teleportation offered mobility that made them nearly impossible to trap or pursue. Illusions proved surprisingly difficult. Creating false images should theoretically be simpler than material manipulations. Yet, making illusions that convinced multiple senses and held up under scrutiny required sophisticated understanding of perception and sensory processing. Early illusions were visually effective, but made no sound or looked correct, but felt wrong when touched, or failed to cast shadows properly. Perfect illusions remained the province of the most skilled practitioners, and even then could rarely be maintained for extended periods. Mind manipulation emerged and was immediately feared. The ability to read thoughts, influence emotions, alter memories. This violated autonomy in ways that physical violence did not. A person whose body was injured remained themselves. A person whose mind was invaded or altered was changed at the most fundamental level. The early development of these techniques was accompanied by debates about ethics and necessity, arguments that would persist for centuries. Some insisted that such abilities should be forbidden entirely. Others argued they were tools like any other, neither good nor evil in themselves. The debates resolved nothing, but the practices continued to develop, employed in secret when open use became untenable. Necromancy was discovered and immediately horrified those who learned of it. The ability to animate the dead, to bind spirits, to prevent or reverse death itself. These abilities existed, but their cost was terrible. Necromantic work required life force, drawn either from the practitioner or from victims. Prolonged practice degraded the practitioner, body and mind decaying as the vital essence that sustained both was consumed in the work. The results were equally disturbing. Animated corpses that moved with horrible parody of life, spirits bound to service against their will, false life that was worse than honest death. Most communities banned necromancy entirely, but the knowledge persisted, passed down among practitioners who valued power over morality. Those who worked extensively with these forces discovered that their practice came with physical costs beyond those immediately obvious. Manipulating reality aged the body prematurely, each working consuming something that should have been preserved. Heavy practitioners looked decades older than their actual years, their bodies withering while their power grew. Some sought methods to offset this cost, ways to maintain youth and vitality despite their practice. They succeeded, partially, developing techniques that slowed aging but could not stop it entirely. The most powerful could extend their lifespan significantly, but immortality remained beyond reach. Glamours allowed practitioners to alter their appearance, maintaining the illusion of youth and beauty, even as their actual bodies aged. These were not illusions in the traditional sense, but physical alterations, reshaping flesh and bone to match desired appearance. The process was painful, required regular maintenance, and eventually failed as the underlying degradation became too severe to conceal. But for decades, or even centuries, a skilled practitioner could maintain any appearance desired, hiding the truth of what their work had cost them. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers formed gradually, as scattered practitioners recognized the need for organization and mutual support. Initially, it was informal, a loose network of those who worked with these forces, sharing knowledge and occasionally cooperating on problems too large for individuals. Over time, it formalized, established rules and hierarchies, created structures for training new practitioners, and arbitrating disputes among them. The Brotherhood became the closest thing to authority that existed in this realm of practice, though its power was always limited by the independence of its members and the suspicion of those who did not wield such abilities. Centuries later, the Lodge of Sorceresses would form, women gathering separately when the Brotherhood proved unable or unwilling to address issues specific to female practitioners. The division was pragmatic rather than hostile, at least initially. Different perspectives and different needs required different organizational structures. The Lodge would eventually become politically powerful in ways the Brotherhood never quite managed, operating with subtlety and long-term planning that their counterparts seemed incapable of matching. Working with these forces altered those who practiced, not merely physically but psychologically. The ability to reshape reality at will affected how practitioners viewed the world and their place in it. Some became arrogant, seeing those without such abilities as lesser, tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. Others withdrew entirely, found interaction with ordinary people difficult after years of manipulating forces that operated on entirely different principles than social dynamics. The disconnect between practitioners and ordinary people widened over generations, mutual understanding eroding as the experiences of their lives diverged. Communities learned to fear practitioners as much as they needed them. One who had mastered these forces could save a village from monsters or could destroy it on a whim, and nothing the villagers possessed could prevent either outcome. The power imbalance created resentment and paranoia. Witch hunts occurred, ordinary people attempting to eliminate threats they could not control. Practitioners responded with defensive measures, then with retaliation, and cycles of violence became self-perpetuating. The towers began appearing, fortified structures where practitioners could work in relative safety, isolated from communities that might turn on them. These towers became centers of learning and research, but also symbols of the division between those who wielded these forces and those who did not. A tower represented power and danger, knowledge and threat, protection and domination simultaneously. Common folk learned to avoid them, to turn away if a rider in fine robes emerged and rode toward their villages. But the towers also represented stability. A region with a tower had protection against certain threats, defenses that no army could provide. The practitioner in the tower might be arrogant and dangerous, but they also prevented worse dangers from taking hold. The relationship was parasitic, perhaps, or symbiotic, depending on the specific practitioner and specific community. Some ruled their regions as tyrants. Others served as protectors. Most fell somewhere between extremes, pursuing their own interests while maintaining enough public good to prevent uprising. The royal courts discovered the utility of these forces. Kings and queens who initially feared and persecuted practitioners eventually realized that employing them was preferable to fighting them. Practitioners as advisors and weapons made kingdoms more powerful, more secure, better able to survive in the post-conjunction world. The relationship between crown and tower was never comfortable, always characterized by mutual suspicion, but it persisted because it served both parties' interests. The price of training became formalized. A child with affinity for these forces could be trained, shaped into a functioning practitioner rather than a danger to themselves and others. But the training required years and resources. The families of prospective students paid in service or gold or political favor. Some students were taken whether families wished it or not. Talent too valuable to waste. Consent irrelevant when survival of communities might depend on having sufficient protection. The practice created resentment, but continued because the alternatives were worse. The physical transformations students underwent during training were extensive. The body had to be prepared to channel these energies safely, altered at fundamental levels to tolerate forces that would destroy unmodified flesh. The process was agonizing, conducted through a series of rituals and preparations that restructured cellular and neural architecture. Most students survived. Those who did not typically died within the first year, their bodies unable to adapt to the changes being imposed. The survivors emerged different, no longer entirely human or elven or dwarf, but something new, something that existed in the space between mundane and extraordinary. Female students underwent additional modifications, adjustments that rendered them infertile, but extended their potential lifespans and enhanced their capacity for working with these forces. The loss of fertility was presented as necessary sacrifice, unavoidable cost of power. Some students accepted this willingly, valuing their abilities above motherhood. Others had no choice. The modifications performed without consultation or consent, trainers deciding that talent was too important to subordinate to individual desires for families. The early generations of trained practitioners were experimental subjects as much as students. The training methods were not yet refined, the balance between enhancement and destruction not yet calibrated. Many emerged damaged, functional in their abilities, but psychologically shattered, their minds unable to process what their bodies had become. They existed as living warnings, examples of what could go wrong when forces and flesh were combined without sufficient care or understanding. But despite all costs and dangers, these abilities had become integral to civilization's survival. The monsters that plagued the world required supernatural countermeasures. The lingering effects of the conjunction required extraordinary healing or containment. The complex problems of governing and defending kingdoms required solutions that no mundane technology could provide. What had arrived as wound had become crutch, then tool, then foundation. The world could not return to what it had been before. Whatever future it would have would be built on these foundations, shaped by these forces, defined by their possibilities and limitations. The age of such power had begun, and it would persist, shaping destiny and destroying it in equal measure. The Aen Seidhe had known the world before. This was the difference that could not be bridged. the gulf that separated their experience from all others who came after. They remembered when reality followed predictable patterns, when death was final as it had been understood and forces beyond nature were not, when the forests were theirs and theirs alone. They had lost more than homes or population. They had lost the world itself, watched it transform into something alien that wore their world's shape without actually being it. The Elven Chronicles, those fragments that survived fire and time and deliberate destruction, speak in tones of grief that span centuries. A scribe whose name became illegible through damage to the text wrote that the conjunction marked the moment when one age ended absolutely, and everything that followed existed in the shadow of that ending, animated by forces foreign to the world's original nature. The Aen Seidhe had existed in what they later came to call the First Age, though that name was retroactive, applied only after what followed began with the conjunction's arrival. The First Age had lasted millennia, elven civilization developing slowly, but achieving heights of art and philosophy that would never be reached again.
Their cities had been works of beauty integrated seamlessly with forests and rivers, architecture that enhanced rather than dominated natural landscape.
Those cities were gone. Some had been destroyed outright during the conjunction, reduced to rubble or simply erased, replaced by landscapes from other worlds. Others had survived structurally but were corrupted, beautiful buildings standing intact while being fundamentally wrong in ways that made them uninhabitable. The streets that had echoed with elven songs for centuries now held only silence and things that should not walk. Cities that had been centers of elven learning, where knowledge from across the continent was gathered, found their great libraries transformed. In one recorded instance, the library structure survived intact, but when scholars entered after the catastrophe passed, they found the physical books present, but the text transformed. The words on pages were no longer readable, replaced by symbols that matched no language, or perhaps by languages from other spheres entirely. The knowledge remained present in physical form, but had become permanently inaccessible, a peculiarly cruel preservation. Some elves went mad from grief, not the immediate madness of those who witnessed the conjunction itself, but a slower dissolution, minds unable to accept the permanence of what had been lost. They wandered ruins speaking to people who were no longer there, acting out the rhythms of lives that could no longer be lived, insisting against all evidence that the old world would return if proper rituals and traditions were simply maintained. Others hardened. They looked at the transformed world and decided that survival required abandoning sentiment, that grief was luxury they could not afford. These elves became warriors and hunters, turned their long lives and accumulated knowledge toward the practical problem of staying alive in a hostile reality. They learned to fight the monsters, developed tactics for killing creatures that should not exist, and in the process became harder and colder than their ancestors would have recognized. The generational divide became absolute. Elves, who had known the world before the conjunction, could not adequately explain to their children what had been lost. Language failed when trying to describe absence, when attempting to convey the fundamental difference between a world that made sense and one that did not. The young heard their elders speak of the First Age and understood the words without grasping the reality they referenced. It sounded like mythology, like the stories all cultures told about better times that probably never existed. But it had existed. The elves who remembered knew this with certainty that made their grief more profound. They had not lost an imagined golden age, but an actual world, tangible and real, that they had walked and known and understood. The loss was not metaphorical, but literal, and the world that replaced it was inferior in every measurable way, except that it still allowed life to continue. The NL remained apart, isolated in their own world or dimension or whatever term adequately described their separation. They had not experienced the conjunction as the Aen Seidhe had, or had experienced a different version of it, or perhaps the distinctions between worlds had affected them differently. The Aen Seidhe knew their distant cousins continued to exist somewhere beyond reach, but contact between the branches of elven civilization became sporadic and strange. The few who claimed to have encountered Aen told stories that made no sense, described meetings that violated causality, or occurred in places that were nowhere. Some among the Aen Seidhe believed the NL had deliberately separated themselves, had seen the conjunction coming, and retreated to sanctuary while their cousins suffered. Others insisted the separation was not choice but consequence, that the conjunction had simply created impassable barriers between related populations. The debates produced no conclusions, only resentment and speculation. The NL became figures of myth and anger, simultaneously envied for their escape and resented for their abandonment. The Aen Seidhe's relationship with the forces the conjunction had introduced was complicated by memory. They had lived for millennia without them in this form, developed sophisticated civilization through craft and art and accumulated knowledge. Whether what they had possessed before was fundamentally different from what arrived, or simply a gentler expression of the same thing, remained unclear. What was certain was that the raw energies now permeating the world felt like violation, like something imposed rather than discovered. Some elves refused to touch them, saw working with such forces as collaborating with what had destroyed their world. They died clinging to pre-conjunction techniques that no longer sufficed, choosing principle over survival. Other elves embraced these abilities with intensity that seemed almost vengeful. If this was the world they must inhabit, they would master its alien rules, become more powerful than the forces that had victimized them. These elves became formidable in their practice, their long lifespans allowing accumulation of knowledge that shorter-lived races could not match. But their relationship with the power they wielded was never comfortable, always tinged with the awareness that they were using tools forged from their world's destruction. The elven practitioners developed techniques distinct from human approaches, where human manipulation was often aggressive and direct. Elven work tended towards subtlety and integration with natural forces that still existed despite corruption. An elven practitioner would not blast an enemy with raw power, but instead manipulate existing elements, redirecting wind or water or growth toward desired effects. The distinction was philosophical as much as practical, elves attempting to work with the world rather than against it, even though the world was no longer what it had been. In later centuries, leaders such as Philavandrel, Aen Seidhe would describe what had been passed down through generations, the slow erosion of elven continuity. Personal writings discovered long after, if they are genuine, speak of losses that could not be replaced. Each year brought diminishment, settlements abandoned, knowledge forgotten, traditions modified until they barely resembled their origins. The Aen Seidhe were not merely declining in population, but losing the unbroken chain linking them to their past. The forests that had been elven domain became contested territory. The monsters that emerged from the conjunction found forests to their liking, establishing territories that overlapped or replaced elven holdings. The Aen Seidhe fought to reclaim their ancestral lands, waged campaigns against creatures that could not be reasoned with or intimidated, that simply existed in spaces the elves insisted belonged to them. The battles were grinding and asymmetric, victories temporary and losses permanent. And then humanity arrived in force, pouring through the rifts that had not fully closed, claiming land that the Aen Seidhe had held since time beyond memory. The humans were a younger race, shorter-lived and more aggressive, and they carried their own traditions of working with the forces the conjunction had unleashed. They saw empty land where elves saw carefully managed wilderness. They built sprawling settlements where elven architecture had been minimal and integrated. They multiplied at rates that elven populations could not match. The first landing, as humans would call it, was, from the elven perspective, an invasion without declaration, an occupation by a force that claimed the right to be present simply by virtue of being able to arrive. The Aen Seidhe protested, argued that humans were intruders in a world that was not theirs. The humans pointed out that the conjunction had shattered all prior claims, that the world was now open to whoever could survive in it, that might and presence established right more surely than ancient history. The conflicts that followed were inevitable. Humans settling in regions the Aen Seidhe considered theirs. Elves driving out human colonies they viewed as invasions, escalation on both sides as grievances accumulated. The wars were not immediate. Took decades to build, from border skirmishes to systematic campaigns, but they came, and they devastated both populations even as the monsters continued to prey on everyone without discrimination. The elven perspective on these early conflicts was characterized by incomprehension. How could the humans not understand that this was elven land, that millennia of occupation granted rights that could not be superseded by mere recent arrival? How could they be so blind to the legitimacy of elven claims, so dismissive of history and precedent? The failure to recognize what seemed obvious to the Aen Seidhe created resentment that would persist for centuries. But the humans had their own perspective, their own history that the elves knew nothing about. They had been driven from their own world by catastrophes the conjunction had caused there, had arrived as refugees fleeing apocalypse, and they saw this new world as salvation, opportunity, home they had earned through suffering of their own. The mutual incomprehension was total, each side viewing the other as aggressor, each side seeing themselves as victims defending legitimate interests. The Aen Seidhe gradually realized they were losing, not through any single defeat, but through attrition. Through the simple mathematics of population and reproduction, humans bred faster, recovered from losses more quickly, could field larger armies and absorb greater casualties. The elves were individually superior in skill and in their mastery of post-conjunction forces and in longevity, but superiority meant nothing when outnumbered 10 to 1, then 20, then more. The great elven cities fell or were abandoned. Places that had stood for millennia became contested territory, changing hands repeatedly until too damaged to be worth holding. Other cities simply emptied, their populations dwindling until maintenance was impossible, until the buildings stood vacant and the forest began to reclaim them. Each loss diminished elven culture further. Libraries burned, artistic traditions forgotten as masters died without training sufficient students. Some elves chose integration, moved into human cities, attempted to find place in societies that viewed them with suspicion or exoticization. They worked as craftsmen or practitioners, used their skills to earn acceptance, sometimes succeeded in building lives that were tolerable, if not fulfilling. But they were always outsiders, always aware that humans saw them as remnants of a displaced people, curiosities or threats, but never equals. Others retreated, withdrew into the deepest forests or most remote mountains, established isolated communities where they could attempt to preserve what remained of traditional elven culture. These communities became increasingly insular, suspicious of all outsiders, hostile to any contact with the changing world beyond their borders. They maintained old ways with religious intensity, speaking only the elder tongue, refusing human goods or practices, living as their ancestors had lived before the conjunction shattered everything. But even in isolation, change was inevitable. The young elves born into these communities knew nothing of the First Age, except through stories, and stories became less vivid with each retelling. The traditions were maintained, but their context eroded. Rituals performed correctly, but without genuine understanding of their original purpose. The isolated communities were museums, preserving forms without substance, performing culture rather than living it. The tragedy of the Aen Seidhe was that they remembered what had been lost clearly enough to grieve it, but could not recover it, could only watch as even the memory faded. Each generation was further removed from the world before the conjunction, less capable of understanding what their ancestors mourned. Eventually, the grief itself would be forgotten, replaced by simple resentment of present circumstances, without clear understanding of why those circumstances felt so wrong. A fragment of verse, attributed to this period, carved into a tree in an abandoned settlement, captured the despair. The world ended, and we did not die. Instead, we watch its corpse decay, and call the rot by our ancestors' names, as if naming could restore what was. The elves had been made refugees in their own world, exiles from a history that still technically existed, but no longer actually did. They walked lands their great-grandparents had known intimately and found them alien, occupied by creatures and peoples who had no understanding of what had stood there before, who built over ruins without ever learning what they were destroying. And through it all, the Aen Seidhe retained their longevity, their slow aging, their capacity to remember across centuries. For shorter-lived races, this might have been mercy, pain dulled by time. For the elves, it was extended suffering, consciousness forced to persist through ages of continuous loss, unable to forget what once was because forgetting required the mercy of death. The world that had ended continued, and the elves continued within it, neither truly alive nor able to die. The humans arrived as intruders and became inheritors. They came through the conjunction in numbers that suggested not infiltration but migration. Entire populations displaced from whatever world they originated in, seeking refuge or conquest, or simply stumbling through rifts they did not understand and could not control. They arrived unprepared for what they found, expected familiar landscapes, and instead discovered a world still reeling from catastrophe, barely stable, populated by monsters and displaced peoples all competing for survival. The early human settlements were precarious, established in haste wherever land seemed relatively safe. Defended against threats the settlers did not yet understand. Whole colonies vanished, wiped out by creatures or environmental effects or simple misfortune. But more kept coming, the flow of refugees through remaining rifts continuing for years after the initial conjunction, each wave adding to human numbers until they represented a presence too large to ignore or eliminate. The humans brought little with them beyond what they could carry, but what they brought included knowledge. Their world had possessed means of working with forces similar to what the conjunction had introduced, had developed systematic approaches to manipulating such energies, and to combat against supernatural threats. This knowledge, adapted to local conditions, gave humans advantages beyond their population numbers. They could fight monsters more effectively than the elder races initially could, had experience with threats that the Aen Seidhe were only beginning to understand. The first human kingdoms were rough affairs, leadership determined more by strength and charisma than by hereditary right or tradition. Warlords gathered followers, claimed territories, established order through force. Some were tyrants, ruling through fear and violence. Others attempted genuine governance, creating structures that would outlast their founders. The quality varied enormously, but the pattern was consistent. Humans organized themselves quickly, adapting to their new world with flexibility that longer-lived races struggled to match. A kingdom that would be called Redania was established by a leader whose name and the title, the Great, were applied retroactively, historical records from that immediate period being fragmentary at best. This kingdom, built through military strength and political arrangements, demonstrated that humans could create lasting structures in the post-conjunction world. The pattern it established was followed by others: Temeria, Cadwyn, Aedern, Sidaris, each carving domains through combination of conquest and colonization. The borders were fluid initially, wars between human kingdoms common as each sought to expand at others' expense. But gradually, territories stabilized. Rulers recognized that constant warfare was unsustainable when monsters represented existential threat to all settlements. The humans' relationship with the elder races was characterized by aggressive displacement. They wanted land for farming and cities, saw elven territories as underutilized, prime locations occupied by populations in decline. The logic was pragmatic rather than malicious. Humans needed space. Elves were not using all the space they claimed. Therefore, humans would take what was needed. That this constituted invasion from the elven perspective was dismissed as irrelevant or misguided, clinging to claims invalidated by the conjunction's reshaping of the world. The wars between humans and elves lasted generations, punctuated by uneasy truces that invariably broke down when human expansion brought them into conflict with elven holdouts. The elves won individual battles through superior skill and mastery of post-conjunction forces, but humans won the wars through numbers and persistence. Each elven defeat was irreplaceable loss. Each human defeat was temporary setback, casualties replaced within a generation by new soldiers from constantly growing populations. The dwarves proved more successful at maintaining autonomy, their mountain holds defensible, and their military might sufficient to make conquest prohibitively expensive. Humans and dwarves reached accommodations, trading relationships that benefited both sides, occasional alliances against common threats. But the relationship was never equal. Humans held the majority of productive land, controlled trade routes, set terms that dwarves could accept or reject but rarely influence. The dwarves maintained their cities but lost their broader cultural influence, became specialized craftsmen and merchants rather than one of the continent's major powers. The gnomes faced worse. Their settlements were less defensible than dwarf holds, their populations smaller, their military traditions less developed. Human kingdoms simply absorbed them, sometimes through conquest, but often through economic pressure and demographic overwhelming. Gnomish culture persisted in pockets, neighborhoods in human cities where Gnomish language and traditions were maintained, but as distinct civilization, the gnomes effectively ceased to exist. They became minorities within human societies, valued for their technical skills, but politically powerless. The halflings adapted through strategic irrelevance. Their lands were agricultural, but not strategically located. Their population small and non-threatening. Their culture focused on matters humans did not particularly care about. Human kingdoms expanded around halfling territories without consuming them, found it more practical to trade with halflings for food than to conquer and administer their lands directly. The halflings maintained autonomy through being useful but unthreatening, a strategy that required accepting subordinate status but preserved their cultural continuity. Human practitioners of the forces the conjunction had unleashed integrated knowledge from elder races, whether reluctantly shared or stolen, creating hybrid traditions that combined human theoretical frameworks with local practical understanding. The result was working with these energies that was more powerful and systematic than either source alone would have produced. Human practitioners became formidable, their influence on kingdoms and politics growing as rulers realized that such power offered advantages no mundane military force could counter. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers became predominantly human, not through exclusion but through demographics. Elven practitioners were few, aging population producing fewer talents each generation. Dwarf practitioners existed but were rare, such traditions never having developed strongly in their culture. Human practitioners simply outnumbered all others, bringing their perspectives and priorities to dominate the Brotherhood's direction. In the centuries that followed the conjunction, as human civilization established itself, organized religion arose. The primary faith worshipped flame as divine manifestation, symbolism drawn from humanity's own history, combined with post-conjunction appreciation for fire's cleansing and protective properties. The church accumulated wealth and power, positioned itself as moral authority, often came into conflict with practitioners whose power was secular and whose work sometimes violated religious doctrines. The church's relationship with non-humans was hostile from early in its development. Doctrine positioned humans as the rightful inheritors of the world, claimed that the conjunction had been a divine act meant to clear the land for human habitation. The elder races were characterized as obstacles or relics, populations that had failed to adapt and therefore deserved displacement. This theological justification for conquest and persecution would have terrible consequences in later centuries. In the generations following the conjunction, as monster populations remained a persistent threat despite the efforts of those who had learned to fight them, a more systematic solution emerged. Human children were subjected to mutations and training that transformed them into specialized monster hunters. The mutations were derived from the work of mages in earlier generations, humans who had experimented with alteration of living flesh through forces the conjunction had made available. The transformation was brutal. Children were given substances that rewrote their biology, processes that killed most subjects, left survivors changed at fundamental levels, enhanced speed and strength, accelerated healing, altered perception that allowed tracking and fighting monsters more effectively, but also sterility, emotional dulling, physical changes that marked them as different, as other. These transformed individuals were made into living weapons against monsters, but the cost was their humanity in ways that went beyond physical alterations. The schools of such warriors established themselves in remote fortresses, training and transforming children away from populations that feared and despised what these individuals represented. The School of the Wolf in Kaer Morhen became most prominent, but others existed: Griffin, Cat, Bear, Viper, each developing distinct philosophies and techniques. The schools were necessary because monsters remained constant threat, because armies could not reliably kill creatures that required specialized knowledge and equipment, because someone had to do the work and these transformed warriors were designed specifically for it. These monster hunters were effective. They killed creatures that had plagued regions for decades, cleared areas for human settlement, prevented attacks that would have devastated communities, but they were never respected, never honored as heroes. They were mutants, aberrations, necessary evils rather than celebrated protectors. They worked for coin because gratitude was not forthcoming, wandered because settling was not allowed, died unmourned because they had been made incapable of forming the connections that made mourning possible. The humans spread across the continent relentlessly. Each generation pushed boundaries further, established new settlements in previously empty regions, connected distant outposts with roads and trade routes. The map was redrawn repeatedly, kingdoms rising and falling, borders shifting, but the overall trend was consistent. Human expansion, human dominance, human reshaping of the world according to their needs and preferences. The post-conjunction world became, over centuries, a human world. Not exclusively, not without resistance, not without cost, but undeniably, the languages spoken in most major cities were human languages. The laws governing most territories were human laws. The cultural norms that defined civilization were human norms. The elder races persisted, but as minorities, remnants, populations defined primarily by what they had lost rather than what they possessed. And humanity called this success, proof of their resilience and adaptability, evidence that they had earned the right to dominance through their capacity to survive and thrive where others had faltered. They built universities and libraries, preserved knowledge, created art and literature, developed philosophies and political theories. Human civilization became genuine civilization, not merely organized survival, but cultural achievement that approached and sometimes exceeded what the elder races had accomplished in their first age. But the foundation remained conquest and displacement, the world made human through systematic elimination or subordination of alternatives. The achievement was real, but so was the cost, paid by populations who had committed no crime except existing in locations humans wanted for themselves. Humanity emerged from the conjunction's chaos as victors, but victory had required becoming something harsh, something capable of looking at other civilizations and seeing obstacles rather than neighbors, something willing to destroy what it could not assimilate. The world would be shaped by human hands for the foreseeable future, and whether that was triumph or tragedy depended entirely on perspective. The conjunction never truly ended. This was the realization that came slowly, over decades and then centuries, as the world failed to stabilize in ways that suggested healing. The initial catastrophe had passed, reality no longer visibly tearing itself apart, but the damage persisted. The world was permanently altered, fundamentally corrupted, existing in a state that would never resolve back to what it had been before. The places of power remained, locations where energy concentrated to degrees that warped local reality. These were not natural features but scars, points where the conjunction had struck with particular force, where the barriers between worlds had torn most completely. Standing in a place of power, a person could feel the wrongness, the sense that multiple realities were still trying to occupy the same space, that the conflict was ongoing even if its intensity had diminished. Some places of power were useful, practitioners drawing on concentrated energy to fuel workings that would otherwise be impossible. Others were simply dangerous, exposure causing mutations or madness or death. All of them were reminders that the world's wounds had not healed, that beneath the appearance of normalcy, the infection persisted. The rifts had closed mostly, but echoes remained. Occasionally, unpredictably, small tears would open, creatures emerging from elsewhere, objects falling through from other realities. These events were rare enough that they did not represent constant threat, common enough that every settlement had stories of strange occurrences, impossible things appearing where nothing should be. The rifts were scabs over wounds that occasionally broke open, bleeding reality that did not belong. Time itself remained damaged in ways that most people never noticed, but scholars documented obsessively. The stars did not move quite as they should, their positions shifting in patterns that violated celestial mechanics as understood before the conjunction. Some regions experienced irregularities, though whether these represented genuine distortions or simply the limits of measurement remained debated. Among those who studied such things, time was no longer perfectly uniform, no longer completely consistent across all locations, though the variations were subtle enough that daily life remained largely unaffected. The dead still rose. Not frequently, not predictably, but regularly enough that burning corpses remained standard practice in most regions. Whatever had allowed reanimation persisted, ambient energy occasionally interacting with recently deceased bodies to produce movement without true life. The ghouls and drowners and other necrophages provided constant reminder that death itself had been corrupted, that the boundary between living and dead was no longer absolute. Dreams became portals, occasionally, to places that were not purely imaginary. Dreamers found themselves in landscapes that persisted after waking, that multiple people could visit independently, that seemed to exist in some intermediate space between thought and physical reality. Accounts exist of shared dream experiences that suggest these realms possess some form of independent existence. Whether these dream realms were created by the dreamers or discovered by them remained debated. Either way, they represented another category of reality, bleed, consciousness itself no longer entirely separated from external world. The mutations continued. Animals and plants exposed to high concentrations of post-conjunction energies sometimes transformed, developing features that natural evolution would never produce: three-headed wolves. Trees that bled. Insects with metallic carapaces that were actual metal rather than organic material. These mutations were not always harmful. Some were even beneficial, but they were always wrong. Violations of biological principles that should govern living things. Human children, elven children, dwarf children, occasionally born with supernatural abilities or features that marked them as touched by forces beyond normal. Some became powerful practitioners. Others developed abilities that had no clear utility, being able to see in complete darkness, or survive without food for weeks, or communicate with animals. These individuals were called sources, beings whose internal capacity for working with these energies exceeded normal limits, and they represented both resource and danger to communities that had to decide how to treat them. Those who hunted monsters discovered that new variations continued to appear, not through reproduction of existing species, but through spontaneous manifestation. A contract to clear out a necker nest might reveal a creature that was necker-like, but different, possessing abilities or features the accumulated knowledge did not document. Whether these were variations within existing species or entirely new entities remained unclear, but the pattern suggested that monster creation was an ongoing process rather than one-time event. The weather patterns remained disrupted centuries after the conjunction. Seasons arrived early or late, or not at all with enough frequency that agricultural planning became difficult. Whether this was due to lingering effects or natural cycles disrupted by the cataclysm remained uncertain. Either way, the result was persistent uncertainty, famines occurring with depressing regularity when harvests failed due to unseasonable conditions. Those who mastered the forces the conjunction had introduced grew more powerful with each generation, not through individual improvement, but through accumulated knowledge and increasingly sophisticated techniques. But their power had limits, boundaries they could not cross, no matter how skilled or determined they became. They could not fully heal the conjunction's damage. They could not permanently seal the rifts or eliminate the lingering reality distortions. They could manage symptoms, could contain specific problems, but cure remained beyond their capacity. Some theorized that another conjunction was possible, that the barriers between worlds remained weakened enough that another catastrophic collision might occur. Others insisted the opposite, that the conjunction had been a unique event that could not repeat. The debates were academic. No one possessed ability to prevent or cause conjunction-level reality failure, but the uncertainty itself was a reminder of the world's fragility, the knowledge that existence persisted at the mercy of forces too vast to control or understand. Prophecies emerged, individuals claiming to see futures or destinies, warning of events to come. Whether these were genuine foresight or elaborate guesses remained unclear, but some prophecies proved accurate enough to suggest that knowing the future was now possible in ways it had not been before. The Elder Blood, lineage supposedly descended from Lara Doran and carrying exceptional capacity for working with these forces, became focus of prophecies suggesting its bearer would shape the world's fate. The world had adapted to its condition, built civilizations on corrupted foundations, developed cultures that accepted monsters and supernatural forces as normal features of existence. But adaptation was not healing. The conjunction's effects were permanent, woven into the fabric of reality so deeply that removing them would require unmaking and remaking the world itself, a process that would likely be as catastrophic as the original event. The survivors and their descendants lived in a world that was fundamentally broken, learning to navigate its dangers and exploit its opportunities without ever being able to fix it. The monsters would never be fully eliminated. The forces introduced would never be controlled completely. The rifts would never be perfectly sealed. These were conditions of existence now, permanent features of a reality that had been rewritten and could not be restored to its previous state. The conjunction's legacy was measured not merely in destroyed cities or altered landscapes, but in changed destinies, in lives that would never be lived because their potential parents had died or never met, in civilizations that might have flourished but instead collapsed. The elder races' decline and humanity's rise, the appearance of transformed monster hunters and practitioners, the entire structure of post-conjunction society, all of it was consequence of that night when the spheres collided. Every person born after the conjunction lived with its effects, whether they understood them or not. The forces that shaped their world, the monsters that threatened their communities, the social structures that defined their opportunities and limitations, all of it traced back to that moment of cosmic catastrophe. The past was present, actively shaping every moment, and would continue doing so for as long as civilization persisted. There was no return to innocence, no restoration of the world that had been. The first age was gone, its passing absolute and irreversible. The current age, whatever number it might be called, was built on ruins that could never be rebuilt, shaped by trauma that could never be fully healed. And still, life continued. People loved and married and raised children. Artists created beauty. Scholars pursued knowledge. Heroes rose to face threats. And ordinary people lived ordinary lives in the spaces between catastrophes. The world was broken, but within its brokenness, meaning persisted. Joy remained possible. Hope survived, however battered. The conjunction had wounded the world deeply, but the wound was slow, taking centuries or millennia to complete its work. In the meantime, in the space between injury and whatever ending might come, existence continued, perhaps diminished but not yet extinguished. The spheres had collided, the world had changed, and in the changed world, new stories were being written, destinies shaped by choices made in response to circumstances no one would have chosen, but everyone had to live with. The Chronicle of the Conjunction was not merely history, but ongoing present, its effects rippling forward through time, shaping the future even as the past receded into memory and myth. The world after the conjunction was the only world that existed now, and those who inhabited it had no choice but to make what lives they could within its scarred landscape, under its wounded sky, surrounded by its persistent dangers. This was survival in the truest sense, not merely remaining alive, but creating meaning in the face of meaninglessness, building civilization on foundations that would never be stable, loving people in a world that could destroy them at any moment for no reason. The conjunction had taught a terrible lesson, that reality itself was fragile, that the rules governing existence were not absolute, that everything could be taken away without warning or justice. But it had also taught resilience, that consciousness could persist through unimaginable trauma, that communities could reform even after being shattered, that life, stubborn and unreasonable, would find ways to continue even in conditions that should make continuation impossible. The Chronicle ends not with resolution, but with continuation. The story ongoing, its conclusion yet to be written. For those who wish to understand more about the world the conjunction created, about the people who struggle within it, and the forces that shape their destinies, more stories wait, more histories to explore, more legends to uncover. The conjunction's shadow stretches across centuries, and those centuries are filled with lives worth knowing, battles worth witnessing, choices worth contemplating. The world is broken, but it is not empty. It is scarred, but not lifeless. It is dangerous, but not devoid of beauty. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all that can be asked. The spheres collided, and the world survived. And survival is its own form of victory, however incomplete. If this chronicle has revealed something worth knowing, If these accounts have illuminated the world's foundations, share this knowledge with others who might benefit from understanding return. When ready to explore what came next, what grew from these ruins, what stories were written on this broken earth, the conjunction was the beginning, terrible and absolute. But it was only the beginning. What followed was a world learning to be itself again, or learning to be something new, or perhaps discovering that the distinction between restoration and transformation was meaningless when survival required both. The chronicle closes, but the story continues, as all true stories do, reaching into the future, shaping destinies yet to unfold, remaining unfinished because the world itself remains unfinished, still healing or still dying, depending on the day and the observer and the hope carried forward into uncertain tomorrow.